on a cold gray morning in late 1606 at the port of London. 3 wooden ships, the Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, were being loaded with supplies, provisions, and unshaped dreams. The wind carried the scent of salt and faint farewells through the white sails. On the decks, over 100 men prepared to set sail. Among them, noble sons, hired soldiers, craftsmen, and fortune seekers. Under the reign of King James I, England was eager to claim its place in the race for colonial glory, competing with Spain and Portugal, powers that had already ventured deep into the New World to turn ambition into action. The king granted a charter to the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company authorized to explore, settle, and trade in a distant land they would call Virginia. The passengers boarding the ships had no real idea what awaited them across the ocean. They had been promised fertile lands, gold, and glory. But behind the grand words lay poor preparation and little understanding of the world they were about to enter. After a final prayer and blessings, the fleet set sail on December 20th, 1606, beginning a transatlantic voyage that would last over 4 months. Headwinds, rough seas, and illness drained their spirits, but none turned back. As the western horizon slowly emerged, none of them knew they were about to become the first to lay the foundation of American history, though the price would be high, paid in hunger, disease, and blood. After more than 4 months drifting across the Atlantic, the English expedition finally caught sight of the Promised Land. On May 13, 1607, the 3 ships, Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery, anchored along a wide river winding through dense forests. The river would later be named the James River, and the land beside it was christened Jamestown in honor of King James I. They had arrived, but the wildness and mystery of the New World chilled the hearts of the weary men. There were no cities, no friendly faces to greet them, only marshes, insects, stifling humidity, and silent eyes watching from the woods, the eyes of the Powhatan people, who observed every movement from the shadows. The settlement site seemed strategically ideal, easily defensible, located upriver and out of reach of Spanish warships. Yet it was low-lying, swampy, with brackish water, thick clouds of mosquitoes, and infertile soil, entirely unsuitable for farming. As the first timbers were raised, makeshift structures emerged, forming a small palisade fort. But problems appeared immediately. Of the 100-plus settlers, most were gentlemen, merchants, or soldiers. Few had any skills in farming or construction. Many still believed they had come to find gold, not to work the land. Supplies dwindled. Dysentery and malaria spread rapidly. Bodies were buried quietly at night to prevent the Powhatan from sensing the settlers' growing weakness. Relations with the Powhatan were tense from the start. There were occasional skirmishes and rare exchanges of food through intermediaries. Language, customs, and mistrust made every encounter a gamble. John Smith, a seasoned soldier and bold explorer, emerged as a de facto leader. He led expeditions upriver, seeking to make contact with surrounding tribes, in search of allies, or at least food. Back at Jamestown, division grew. Some plotted mutiny, others sank into despair. The sweltering summer gave way to a freezing winter. Men died from hunger, disease, and even at the hands of one another. Yet amid the misery, a small miracle occurred. A group of Native Americans appeared at the edge of the settlement, bringing corn and fish for trade. Among them was a young girl with striking eyes, Pocahontas, daughter of Chief Powhatan. No one knew yet that she would become a symbol of hope and a fragile bridge between two worlds. As the first winter descended upon Jamestown, all romantic illusions of a promised land began to shatter. Harsh reality swept through the makeshift wooden fort like a cold wind. Hunger, disease, and despair consumed everything. More than half of the original 104 settlers died within the first few months. They died from brackish water, malaria, dysentery, and most of all, starvation. With no farmlands, no agricultural knowledge, and no gold to trade for food, the survivors began looking at one another with wary, haunted eyes. Amid the chaos, John Smith, a soldier who had fought across Europe, rose as a pillar of survival. With firm leadership, he introduced a strict rule: he who does not work shall not eat. Despite resistance from the idle gentlemen, Smith reorganized the settlement, assigning duties, demanding labor, enforcing patrols, and collecting water. He did not do it for power, but because he knew that without discipline, they would all perish. Still, food remained scarce. Smith led expeditions along the James River to reach nearby native tribes, seeking to trade for food, or, when desperate, to take it by force. Each mission was dangerous. One misstep could ignite full-scale war. On one such expedition, Smith was captured by Powhatan warriors. He was brought before Chief Wahunsanako, leader of the Powhatan Confederacy. According to legend, just as Smith was about to be executed, a young girl threw herself over him, pleading for his life. That girl was Pocahontas, the chief's beloved daughter. Whether this act was ritualistic theater or genuine compassion remains debated. But to Smith, it was a moment between life and death. He was released and returned to Jamestown, not only alive, but now with a deeper understanding of native politics and survival. Though Smith had been spared, relations with the Powhatan remained fragile. At times, they traded corn for tools, beads, or copper, but a single misunderstanding could end in bloodshed. Tensions mounted as the English began expanding the fort and demanding more. By mid-1608, a new group of settlers arrived from England, bringing fresh supplies, tools, and hope. Yet, once again, many were gentlemen, unaccustomed to physical labor. Jamestown had more people, but also more mouths to feed, and fewer willing hands. The newcomers still dreamed of gold and empire, blind to the looming shadow of death. The price of illusion had become painfully clear. Without change, labor, and adaptation, they would be buried by this land. John Smith understood this better than anyone. He clashed with the colony's council, faced threats of assassination, but never wavered. Survival demanded truth, not fantasy. Winter of 1608 brought yet another test, though not as brutal as the infamous starving time to come. It was harsh enough to warn them. Small, unmarked graves appeared among the pine trees, nameless, silent mounds of earth. Yet even in that darkness, a small seed of hope quietly took root. The fragile bond forming between Smith and Pocahontas. The courage of a few ordinary men, and the growing belief that if they truly changed, this land could one day become home. By the end of 1608, Jamestown was no longer the promised land imagined by those who had set sail from London. It had become a crumbling wooden fort, surrounded by dense forests, swamps, and the silent presence of death. The survivors, now barely 40, no longer dreamed of gold or glory. Their only goal was simple: to stay alive, day by day, breath by breath. At the center of that fragile survival was John Smith. Since becoming president of the Jamestown Council, Smith had enforced a singular, unrelenting rule: the discipline of survival. To him, Jamestown was not an opportunity for fortune. It was a brutal test of human endurance against nature and human folly alike. Each day, he assigned men to guard duty, construction, water collection, and hunting. He who does not work shall not eat. The rule, harsh as it was, kept them from collapsing completely. But their efforts were constantly threatened by three deadly realities: a lack of food, a lack of capable laborers, and a fragile relationship with the Powhatan natives. Fragile life and dangerous ignorance, the English still did not understand the ecology of Virginia. Summers were blistering, with mosquitoes thick as smoke clouds and brackish water unfit for drinking. Winters were freezing and desolate, with dried-up trees and scarce game. They didn't know when to plant, when to hunt, or how to read the rhythms of this land. So they became dependent on the Powhatan people who had lived here for thousands of years. Smith knew this. With a small team, he frequently traveled along the James River and its branches, seeking out native villages to trade for corn, beans, squash, and dried fish. These trips sometimes ended with shared meals, but just as often with arrows, shattered spears, and blood. Tension, conflict, and the intervention of Pocahontas. Relations between the English and the Powhatan Confederacy were stretched tight, always on the brink. During one failed negotiation, Smith was ambushed. He would likely have been killed if not for the intervention of Pocahontas, a girl barely 12 or 13 years old. Why she risked herself for a foreigner is still debated. Some say she saw Smith as a friend. Others believe it was a calculated peace gesture by her father, the chief. Regardless, it was the second time Pocahontas saved Smith's life. Whenever Pocahontas arrived at Jamestown with a small group, bringing corn, fruit, or fish, the atmosphere softened. She became a symbol of fragile hope, a living bridge between two vastly different worlds. But peace never lasts forever. Injury, division, and a sudden departure by late 1609, disaster struck. Preparing for a river expedition, Smith was badly injured in a gunpowder explosion. A critical wound in an era without medicine or trained doctors. The wound festered and grew worse. Too weak to lead, he was forced to return to England for treatment. In October 1609, Smith boarded a ship and left Jamestown behind, a colony already teetering on collapse. His departure was like the extinguishing of a final lamp. Without him, leadership fractured. Some men clung to dreams of finding gold. Others wanted to retreat. Still others turned savage, stealing from each other to survive. Trade with the Powhatan ceased, and food supplies dwindled. Then winter came, the beginning of the starving time, the worst nightmare, the winter of 1609 to 1610. Later known as the starving time, became the darkest chapter in Jamestown's history. But it all began the moment John Smith left. With no strong leadership, the colony descended into chaos. The Powhatan surrounded the fort, cutting off all external foraging and trade. The cold was merciless. The settlers consumed every last animal, then resorted to eating shoe leather, tree bark, roots, even the corpses of the dead. That terrifying story belongs to the next chapter. This chapter ends with the image of a broken Jamestown, without its leader, without food, without a clear future. What was once promised to be the heart of a mighty empire had become a flickering candle before the darkest night. The horrific winter of 1609 to 1610, known as the Starving Time, claimed nearly 90% of Jamestown's population. From over 500 settlers inside the fort, only around 60 remained, emaciated, trembling, desperate, living like shadows among scorched wood and frozen mud. They were no longer colonists, nor gentlemen or merchants. They were simply survivors, driven not by ideals, but by instinct. In May 1610, those remaining made the painful decision to abandon Jamestown. They loaded their meager belongings onto boats and drifted away, leaving behind unmarked graves and a dream of colonization that seemed to have ended in failure. But fate wasn't done with them yet. A rescue fleet and Lord de la Ware, as their boats sailed down the James River, something unexpected appeared on the horizon. A fleet of ships heading upstream, carrying food, weapons, reinforcements, and hope. Leading the fleet was Thomas West, Lord de la Ware, the new governor appointed directly by King James I. He immediately ordered the survivors to return and reoccupy Jamestown. With no other option, they turned back, stepping into a new chapter of survival. Lord de la Ware was a strict, military-minded man. He ordered the fort to be rebuilt, defenses re-established, and order imposed through harsh discipline. Idlers were whipped, deserters executed. But he also brought food, medicine, and a belief that the colony could endure. Thanks to this critical support, Jamestown not only escaped extinction, it began to rise again from the ashes. The arrival of John Rolfe and the brown gold that saved the colony among the new arrivals was a relatively unknown figure. John Rolfe, a young English merchant who quietly brought with him a special strain of tobacco from the Caribbean. Rolfe understood that if Jamestown was to survive long-term, it could not rely on dreams of gold. He believed tobacco was the key. In 1611, Rolfe began planting his new tobacco variety in the soil around Jamestown. Though the land was poor for most crops, it proved remarkably well suited to tobacco. The plant grew quickly, with thick, aromatic leaves, perfect for drying and curing. Rolfe processed the leaves and shipped the first samples back to England. When the Virginia tobacco reached London, the English elite fell in love. Its flavor was stronger, bolder, and more wild than Spanish tobacco. Within a few years, Virginia tobacco became the colony's primary export, generating enormous profits for the Virginia Company and the settlement. This brown gold would save Jamestown. A fateful marriage, John Rolfe and Pocahontas in 1613. Tensions with the Powhatan Confederacy remained high. During a military raid, the English captured Pocahontas, using her as leverage to demand the return of prisoners and open peace negotiations. Unexpectedly, during her captivity, Pocahontas was not mistreated. Instead, she was cared for, taught English, and introduced to Christianity. Eventually, she converted and took the name Rebecca. During this time, she met John Rolfe, and the two developed a sincere bond. Despite cultural and religious differences, in 1614, Pocahontas and Rolfe married the first official union between an Englishman and a Native American. Their wedding was not just a personal matter. It became a symbol of fragile peace between two warring worlds. The marriage ushered in 8 years of peace between the English and the Powhatan, a priceless window that allowed Jamestown to stabilize, expand, and grow. The early signs of a colonial society with the return of stability. Jamestown began to show the first signs of a functioning society. Tobacco fields stretched along the banks of the James River. Brick houses gradually replaced wooden huts. The first children were born in Virginia, the first English generation born in the New World. However, not all was hopeful. To support the booming tobacco industry, the colony began importing indentured servants from Europe, men and women bound by contracts to work in harsh conditions for years. And just a few years later, the first African slaves arrived on the shores of the James River. A new seed had been planted, but darkness had entered with it. From the ashes of failure and famine, Jamestown had risen through discipline. The introduction of tobacco and an unexpected marriage. But would this fragile flame survive the coming storms of politics, war, and ambition? After more than a decade of teetering between life and death, hunger and illusion, the Jamestown colony finally entered a period of relative calm. The historic marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas in 1614 was indeed merely a romantic tale. It became a powerful symbol of reconciliation between two worlds, the English settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy. For the next 6 years, no major conflict broke out. Though both sides remained cautious, they put down their weapons for a time, opened trade, and allowed the fragile shoots of life to take root in the Virginia soil. A colony transformed from 1614 onward, Jamestown underwent a dramatic transformation. Once a place of death and chaos, the settlement on the banks of the James River slowly blossomed with endless tobacco fields, brick houses, dirt roads, shipyards, and even the colony's first wooden church. The scent of drying tobacco filled the air, the smell of life, money, and a colonial dream turning real. John Rolfe became a pioneer in tobacco cultivation and processing. Not only did he ship hundreds of pounds of tobacco to England each year, but he also carefully recorded techniques for planting, curing, and fermenting, turning Jamestown into America's first major tobacco exporting hub. Thanks to this success, immigration from England surged. By 1619, the colony's population exceeded 1,000 people, an unprecedented figure after 12 brutal years of struggle. A new life, but not an equal one. As the colony expanded, the seeds of inequality and social tension began to take root. The booming tobacco industry demanded an enormous labor force. At first, The settlers relied on indentured servants from Europe, poor individuals who agreed to work for 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage to the New World. Their lives were harsh, heavily controlled, and many died before gaining freedom. But in the summer of 1619, a silent shift occurred. A Dutch ship arrived at Point Comfort carrying around 20 Africans. These individuals were not indentured servants. They were the first African slaves in the history of British North America. Few at the time grasped the full weight of that moment. But clearly, a new, dark door had been opened, beginning centuries of racial injustice and bondage. Pocahontas, from native princess to political icon meanwhile, Pocahontas, now Rebecca Rolfe. After years of peaceful life in Jamestown, was invited to England in 1616 with her husband and young son. In London, she became a living symbol of the Virginia colony's success, a civilized Indian princess who had converted to Christianity and married into English society. English nobles were fascinated. Painters rushed to capture her likeness, and even the king wished to meet her. Yet, life in the damp, cold climate of England was harsh for a woman of the forests. Pocahontas's health quickly deteriorated. In 1617, while preparing to return to Virginia, she suddenly died in Gravesend, England, at about 20 years old. John Rolfe, devastated, returned to Jamestown with their son, Thomas, carrying the memory of a love that had briefly soothed the fires of war, but only briefly. The first steps toward colonial democracy. 1619 marked another milestone. The first meeting of the House of Burgesses, the first elected legislative assembly in English America, held right in Jamestown. For the first time, free men were chosen to represent their districts and help shape the laws of the colony. The meeting was humble. Just a few dozen men in a small wooden church, but it planted the seed of democracy in the New World. They debated taxes, land rights, and protection, things previously dictated solely by the English crown. On the other side of the forest, a storm was brewing. Despite the surface-level peace, the Powhatan Confederacy had not forgotten the raids, the deaths, and the expanding tobacco fields that encroached on their lands. When Chief Powhatan, Wahunsenako, died in 1618, his successor was Opatankano, a brilliant and bitter warrior. He saw the truth. Tobacco brought wealth to the English, but it stole land from the natives, destroyed forests, and erased culture. Beneath the fragile peace, a volcano was beginning to rumble. Between 1613 and 1619, Jamestown experienced a fragile and temporary peace. The colony grew. Its economy flourished. Its people organized, and even democracy began to take shape. But within that peace, seeds of future conflict were already sown. Between two civilizations whose visions for the land could not coexist forever, because peace was only temporary. In 1620, as another ship named Mayflower arrived further north, at a place that would become Plymouth, the colony of the Puritans, things in the South, in Jamestown, were moving down a much darker path. Tobacco was still bringing in gold. The population was growing. Lands were expanding. And the colonial dream was becoming a reality. But along with it came greed, conflict, and the forgetting of past lessons. During the fragile 7-year peace, the English had pushed further and further into Powhatan territory, building plantations, cutting forests, laying roads, no longer bothering to negotiate. For Opechancanough, the new Powhatan chief, the time had come to end the peace with blood. The massacre of March 22, 1622. On the morning of March 22, 1622, as the sun barely rose, Powhatan warriors launched a coordinated surprise attack on over 30 English settlements along the James River. They used spears, tomahawks, and the trust that some English settlers still held for them. In just a few hours, over 347 English settlers were killed, nearly 1/3 of the entire colony's population. Villages were burned, women and children slain, and the survivors fled back to the safety of Jamestown's fort. The Powhatan deliberately spared Jamestown itself, hoping to shock the settlers into retreating from their lands. Not to annihilate them, but they miscalculated. The English did not retreat. They retaliated, a vicious cycle of revenge and destruction. Following the massacre, the boundary between two cultures disintegrated. No more marriages, no more diplomacy, no more respect, only fire, steel, and blood. The English launched brutal counterattacks, burning villages, poisoning food supplies, destroying crops. They used a strategy of attrition, not just to kill warriors, but to starve and crush entire native communities. What began as a native effort to reclaim their homeland quickly turned into a full-scale campaign of invasion and suppression. Over the next decade, thousands of Powhatan people died. Their confederacy fractured. Their lands were pushed back into the forests and swamps. Jamestown, meanwhile, grew stronger, but the cost was a permanent wound between two civilizations. The first African slaves and the legacy of bondage. At the same time, war raged with the native peoples. Jamestown was becoming entwined with another brutal reality: slavery. From the first African arrivals in 1619, just a few years later, enslaved Africans became the primary labor force for the expanding tobacco plantations. These were no longer indentured servants. They were considered property for life, bought, sold, and inherited. No one then could have imagined that this system would continue for over 200 years. But Jamestown was the birthplace of African slavery in British North America, a legacy that would stain American history for centuries. The fall of Jamestown and the birth of a nation. By the late 1620s, Jamestown was no longer a survival outpost. It had become a center of government and commerce for the colony of Virginia. But even as it grew, harsh climate, disease, floods, and war made it less livable. In 1699, the capital was officially moved to Williamsburg, several miles inland. Jamestown was gradually abandoned, swallowed by vines, trees, and time. But from this place, a nation had taken root. It was in Jamestown that the first experiments in self-government occurred with the House of Burgesses. It was here that America's first cash crop economy began with tobacco. It was here that racial conflict first exploded, leaving scars that would last generations. And it was here that the American dream, glorious and flawed, began its first chapter. Legacy and darkness, the story of Jamestown, is not a tale of pure heroism. It is a complex portrait of ambition and cruelty, survival and oppression, hope and betrayal. Those who lived and died in Jamestown paved the way for a new nation. But they also left behind wounds and questions that future generations would have to confront. Jamestown ended, but America was only just beginning.